Today I'm going to help you decide which one of these grinders is the right one for you. This video is brought to you by AeroPress. They have a big Black Friday sale with up to 20% off. You can get all the details in the description. Now, the Baratza Encore ESP and the Fellow Opus, these two grinders have become my top recommendations for all-around grinders at their price point of about 200 bucks. They both do filter and espresso. They have a lot of give and take between the two grinders. I like both of them. I've recommended both of them to different people for different reasons, so I thought it would be best to break them down and compare them kind of line by line. First, let's talk about build quality. Now, both these grinders have kind of a plastic body, with plastic components throughout. Very typical for what you would see at the price point, so that didn't really freak me out too much. Now, a couple of things specific to each grinder. The Encore, it's a little loose, a little rattly, something I don't really love, especially, with this part up here, the hopper. This is what you touch every time you make an adjustment, and you don't want that to kind of feel a little loose. So that's a bit of a detractor there for me. On the Opus, it doesn't really have anything that is kind of rattling around. However, down here, and particularly on the black model, I found that over time, this surface right here was a little bit prone to some scuffing. Overall, both these grinders are pretty comparable in terms of build quality, so I'm going to call this one a draw. Let's move on to noise, and this is something that a lot of people really want to look at when they're trying to buy a coffee grinder. And unfortunately for Baratza, the Fellow Opus is the clear winner here. Even with this lid off, it still is a much quieter grinder than the Encore ESP. And that becomes even more dramatic once you put the lid on. Point to Fellow. Now, speed is another factor that a lot of people will look at when they're evaluating coffee grinders. And on this one, the Baratza Encore ESP had the edge. For me, doing an 18-gram espresso shot, I was grinding about 18 seconds, and the Opus was taking 6 to 7 seconds longer than that. On filter, the ESP also had the edge on speed there, so here I'm going to give a point to Baratza. Now let's get into the weeds a little bit more on these grinders, and I'm going to talk about hopper style workflow first, then single dosing workflow. Now, if you're the type of person where you buy one bag of coffee at a time, you want to throw it into your hopper and kind of forget about it, you don't switch coffees very often, you have to ask yourself, can the coffee grinder that I'm looking for actually fit a whole bag of coffee into the hopper? Otherwise, you're going to end up single dosing, weighing out one serving at a time, or kind of filling up from your bag several times as you work through it. And in this case, only one of these grinders can actually fit a full 12-ounce bag of coffee, and that is the Baratza. So I'm going to give a point there for hopper workflow. Now, a little bit of a caveat here: if you are considering a hopper style workflow, anytime you're making a big adjustment from filter to espresso, you're going to want to purge a little bit of extra coffee out of the grinder so that you don't end up with filter grounds in your espresso shot or vice versa. Just something to consider. Now, for a single dosing workflow, this is if you for any reason want to measure out one serving of coffee at a time. Good example of that would be if you like to have a couple bags of coffee on hand, or maybe you want the odd late night decaf. The Baratza does have a single dosing hopper that you can get, and now it costs extra, but the Fellow Opus hopper and workflow really is more designed for single dosing. And also, because of the way that the internals are designed, it's going to retain a little bit less, particularly at espresso settings, than the Encore. So we're going to get more into that in a bit, but on single dosing workflow, I'm going to give the point to Fellow. Now let's talk about the Burrs specifically. Both of them use a 40mm 6-spoke burr design. The inner burrs are pretty much exactly the same size, and they give similar performance. So I'm going to call this one a draw. Something else that we should compare between these two, because they're all-around grinders, is the actual range. Now, on the espresso range, I found they were pretty comparable, but on the filter range, how coarse the grinder can go, I actually found the Baratza to be able to go quite a bit coarser with the stock setup. So on range, that one kind of surprised me, but I'm going to give the point to Baratza. Okay, Let's talk about dialing in espresso. And this is one of the more contentious points between these grinders. They're both released at around the same time. The Opus came out slightly before the Encore, and they did something really innovative with this grinder in order to give espresso level precision in an all-around package for a low price. And what they did there was they have their adjustments on here that you can make, but then when you get down into the espresso settings, they have a micro adjustment that you can adjust in here to give you a very fine level of precision. Now, it was very innovative what they did, and you kind of do get the hang of it, but it is also pretty confusing when you're first starting to wrap your head around it, and it's probably my least favorite thing about this grinder. Then Baratza comes along and releases the Encore ESP, and I have to say, they really did do this better. They've taken all of that complication of bringing the precision of espresso without sacrificing the range of filter. You know, they've done complicated things with thread pitch and burr gap, and they've kind of hidden it all away with some clever engineering so that you just have a very simple adjustment to rotate the hopper and dial in either with a very fine degree of precision or a lot of range for filter. Now, this is a big factor because dialing in espresso can be a pretty big headache, especially when you're just getting started, which is likely if you're looking at either one of these grinders. So because this experience is so different and the implementation by Baratza is so much better, I'm gonna give 2 points to Baratza for this one. Okay, now let's talk about retention. Basically how much coffee is retained inside each one of these grinders as a part of normal use. And this is something that you would want to kind of see minimized. Now, on the Opus, when I was doing an espresso shot to shot, I would typically find there would be about 0.3 grams of retention for me. Now, that's going to vary coffee to coffee and based on your relative humidity. I'm here at about 60%, and the remaining 0.3 grams I could just kind of knock out by giving it a little tap like that, and I would end up with a flat in out, which is very good. Now, the reason for that low retention stat is because the Opus kind of has this straight fall through design. There's nothing really for the grounds to get caught in on the way down, and it's got something called an ionizer inside, which applies a very small electric charge to the grounds as they're getting dispensed, eliminating a lot of static, which can create buildup. Now, the Baratza doesn't have either of those things. Instead, it relies on kind of this paddle wheel design to get the grinds out of the grinding chamber and into the hopper. And this is probably my least favorite thing about the Baratza, because while shot to shot, it's very similar to the Opus. I was getting about 0.3 grams retention. A lot of that is exchange. And inside the grinder, I could have anywhere from 1.5 all the way up to almost 3 grams of retention kind of caked in around that paddle wheel at espresso settings. So for this one, I'm definitely going to give the point to Fellow. Now, retention on filter coffee was a little higher. I was measuring about 0.5 grams for both grinders. And some of that was because, you know, before it gets to the ionizer, some static would kind of cause things to cake up in here. In here, I find it didn't cake in around the paddle wheel as much on filter settings, but it was kind of on the way kind of down into the hopper. Now on this one, that 0.5 grams, again, you could just knock it out. On the Baratza, you hit it on the top, it doesn't come out. It's still in the grinder. So again, retention on filter, I'm gonna give another point to Fellow. Now, I do want to talk and rate static specifically as well, because this is one of my biggest pet peeves when I'm testing or using grinders at home. There's nothing more frustrating than when you're using a grinder and there's static as the beans are coming out and it just kind of is leaving grounds all over the place. And the Opus really manages this well with that ionizer. You know, as the grounds are coming out, there's not a lot of static. The Baratza, on the other hand, you know, depending on the coffee, again, and your relative humidity, there can be a lot of static. So I'm going to give a point on this one to Fellow. Now let's talk about maybe the most important factor when you're evaluating a grinder: taste. And I have to be honest, on both espresso and filter, for an entry-level grinder, I found both of these grinders to give very good and very comparable results. You know, there are some minor differences that I can sometimes pick out on a blind test, and other times I mess it up and I guess wrong. So whichever one you end up choosing, you're gonna end up very happy with the taste. So I'm gonna call this one a draw and give a point to each. You know, I have to say, I was very impressed, you know, grinding espresso, doing pour overs, batch brew, or AeroPress, who is a sponsor of today's video and one of my top recommended brewers. I used one of these for many years before I ever started making YouTube videos, and I love recommending them for people, whether or not they're shopping for themselves or gifting for somebody else. AeroPress has a big Black Friday sale where you can get up to 20% off on a lot of different bundles, including this one, the clear with the flow control cap. The thing I probably love about it the most is when I first started using it, it was an immediate step up from what I was doing before in terms of flavor. And still today, almost a decade later, I'll put some of my nicest coffees through one of these things. Highly recommend for both enthusiasts and beginners. You can check out the details in my description. Now, let's get back to grinders and continue our comparison. I do want to rate overall cleanliness. And this one is kind of weird because the Baratza produces a lot more static. So you might assume that I'm going to give the point here to Fellow. The difference in design here is all the kind of mess kind of hides out in here because it's black, and you can kind of ignore it a little bit, so it kind of accumulate a bit before you feel like you really want to clean it. This one, on the other hand, the Opus, there's not a lot of static, and you can not really knock out any retention, but literally any ground here, particularly on the white one, but also kind of on the black one, it really does stand out, and you feel like you need to clean it like almost every time. And if you ever forget to kind of slap it on the top or to use these as a bit of a bellows to push some air through to get that last little bit of retention out, you're gonna knock your grinder and it's gonna fall out onto this plate here, and then you gotta wipe it off. It's a bit tedious. So for overall cleanliness, even though it gets more static, I'm going to give the point here to Baratza. Lastly, I want to talk about counter appeal. Now, this one is going to be subjective, and I've talked to enough people to know that different people are going to prefer one of these over the other. Now, my personal preference is for the Opus. I like the more modern look, the clean lines. The Baratza, I like the changes they made with the ESP compared to the original Encore. I like the white version. It's a little more off-white than a stark white. That's not really a plus or a minus, but just for the sake of tying things up, I'm going to go with my personal preference and give this one to the Opus. So we're kind of in a tricky situation here. Point by point, we have a tie. And I didn't think it would come out quite that evenly when I was preparing for this video. But I don't really think that we should weight all of those factors equally. And depending on what's important to you, I think you should probably consider some of them a deal breaker, which is why I end up recommending different ones to different people. If you want to have a hopper full of beans, there is only one grinder that can do that. And if you want a single dose, you enjoy decafs or several coffees all on the go at the same time, the Opus is really more purpose-built for that. The Baratza gives a far more intuitive and kind of simple dial-in for espresso. And for some of you, that's going to be the only factor that you want to hear anything about, and it will kind of cancel out anything that the Opus might have going for it, and that's totally fair. For others of you, maybe you'll want the quiet operation and aesthetics that the Opus has. Maybe you're a bit of a purist and you'll put up with a harder dial-in to get lower overall retention. Both make fantastic coffee, so I want to know, for you, out of all the different factors that we've discussed, which one of these would you end up with? Are you an owner of either the Encore or the Opus? If so, how has your experience been, and would you make a different decision if you had to do it again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope your next cup of coffee is fantastic, and we'll see you next time.